If you want to turn to Matthew chapter 15 or Mark chapter 8, I think we'll probably maybe look at Mark's account primarily and use the others as, well, at first anyway. We'll eventually phase into Matthew's account mostly in Matthew chapter 16, but the end of Matthew 15 as well as Mark chapter 8 as well eventually as Luke chapter 9 is going to be our text here. We're starting this next part 7 of this study of the life of Christ, this series that's been ongoing for this whole year and will continue for the rest of the year. The final Galilean ministry, or the final phase maybe of the Galilean ministry of Jesus. We'll be looking today at the Great Confession, or the Good Confession as it's called. It is pretty great. It's probably called the Good Confession more in the Scriptures. And it sort of revolves around the question of who Jesus is. Who do you say Jesus is? Who would you say? If somebody asks you, what do you think about Jesus? Who do you think He is? What do you say about Him? What do you believe? What would you say? What if somebody then asked you about the church? Tell me about the church. What can you say about the church as far as the Bible is concerned? What does the Bible say about the church? Or what can you tell me about the church that is centered around and was established by and purchased with Jesus' blood? What can you say about it? In the last lesson, we looked at Jesus feeding the 4,000. That was Wednesday night. But we can't forget that background of Jesus wanting to go away quietly with His disciples. And as we've been pointing out with these last few lessons, He hasn't been able to do that yet. Every time He tries, something messes it up, which is usually people showing up and needing, and He always healed them, helped them, primarily even taught them. But again, He tried to go away, and this large crowd of people showed up. He fed them again, just like He had some time before. And now He's continuing to try to withdraw Himself with His apostles. And that's what He's going to do here. And really more than once in this lesson, He's going to do that. And we're going to reach a climactic part of Jesus' ministry over the next several lessons. And you could almost say this here was a great turning point in Jesus' ministry. We've seen a couple great turning points. There was more of a negative turning point in a way in John 6 whenever a lot of the disciples, a lot of people that followed Jesus left Him, didn't follow Him anymore because of some of the things that He had said. They didn't get it. They didn't understand it. They didn't like it. So they turned away and did not follow Him anymore. But in the space of a week from this time, a few very significant events will occur. The Good Confession, which we'll see today. Jesus unveils His plan and intention to build His church. We'll also see that this morning. Then we see also His first clear announcement, the first clear announcements of His death and resurrection and return. We'll see that in the next lesson. And the Transfiguration will occur within a week of this time as well. But today we'll get to the Good Confession, Mark chapter 8, as well as Matthew 15 and 16, and the announcement of the church. But we've got to make a few stops along the way, which we'll do starting right now. First of all, in Galilee, which is where He has been for a while and is, notwithstanding His brief time in the region of Tyre and Sidon, as well as down in the Decapolis. Now, at that time, He was on the east side of the lake when He fed the 4,000 rather. Now they get into a boat and they go back across the lake, the Sea of Galilee, and they come to the western side of the Sea of Galilee. We don't know exactly where they were, but it was apparently near the village of Magdala, about 4 miles north of Tiberias, perhaps. And here's what we're going to read in Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 10. Or verse 11, rather. The Pharisees came and began to argue with Him, seeking from Him a sign from heaven to test Him. And He sighed deeply in His spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. So, here, tries to go away again. Pharisees show up, and they did what they often did. They wanted to trap Jesus. They were seeking a sign. But Jesus rarely responded favorably to anybody seeking a sign. But in their case, it was even less favorable because they were seeking a sign specifically for the purpose of testing him. They wanted to test him. And even though I already gave the answer, in what way were they testing him?
They wanted a sign from heaven.
Okay.
For him to prove he was going to be.
Okay. So, it's sort of an overload of prepositional phrases because of that. They were seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. So we have the motive. They were seeking a sign from heaven, but they wanted him to do it. And in some way, this is going to be testing him. Maybe it was to test his identity. Maybe they were hoping that whatever sign he might perform might provide an occasion for them to say, aha, look what he's done, or when he's done it. We know they did that almost every time he did something on the Sabbath day. He did that on the Sabbath day. They never seemed to try to deny that he did the thing, but they focused on when he did it, which was usually when he did things on the Sabbath day. So totally missing the significance to focus on something that the law didn't even specify. But at any rate, their motives were impure, and Jesus did not bother himself. He didn't trouble himself. Whenever somebody's motives were not sincere, he didn't trouble himself. Now, when their motives were sincere, he almost always troubled himself, if not always. Even in the small matters, the small things that we might call them, the little things, and even when it's extremely inconvenient, timing or whatever for him. Even on the occasion when he was on his way to try to heal this man's daughter who was dying, a time when anybody like us would think that's the time to hurry. Even then, he stopped to help. But these Pharisees were not wanting any genuine information. They weren't sincerely seeking anything. Yes, sir?
You say that he wouldn't bother with people with insincere motives. He wouldn't bother to give a sign or even to give an answer. I ask because when the Sadducees came with the case of a woman and 7 brothers, they weren't, I think, exactly sincere. They really didn't want to know. They denied that there is a resurrection in the first place. But not only he answered the question, he answered also their implicit motive in a loving way, I think. He said, you are greatly mistaken, like somebody who cares.
Yes, so when he deemed it necessary or beneficial, he would, even if their motives were bad. Like they thought they knew the answer on that occasion, and he knew that they were missing. So, like you said, their argument or their belief was built upon a false premise. So he straightened that out. But he didn't always do that. And sometimes, like when they came to him and saying, the baptism of John, where did it come from? And he said, well, you answer my question, I'll answer yours. And then they said, yeah, we don't think we want to answer that question. He said, okay, I'm not going to answer your question. But so he did do that sometimes, but with a sign, like you distinguished, he, as far as I can remember, never performed a sign when somebody demanded him to perform a sign. Especially in a situation like this, whenever these people had no purpose whatsoever but to try to test him and trap him in some way. Wayne, okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry that I have another question. Maybe I get them all out now. In Mark, in fact, he says, no sign will be given this generation. Okay. And in Matthew and in Luke, instead, he says, only one sign shall be given, and then that's the sign of Jonah. And in fact, the two Gospels, Matthew and Luke, say the sign of Jonah, but one in one way, that Jonah was a sign for those of Nineveh. And the other, in a different way, Jonah stayed 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish. But neither of them says no sign. So I wonder if you would or could say something about that.
Your question is about why
when he says that why this generation asks for a sign, no sign shall be
no
given.
sign but the sign of Jonah.
Well, in Mark he says no sign, and that truly means something also, that these three Gospels report it differently.
Mm-hmm. So Matthew says no sign but the sign of Jonah. Mark says no sign.
Mm-hmm. And Luke also says no sign by the sign of Jonah.
No sign but the sign of Jonah.
Yes,
okay.
And then Matthew and Luke elaborate differently. I mean, what do you mean the sign of Jonah? I think in Matthew it says Jonah stayed 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish.
Yes.
So it's the sign of Jonah in that sense, and we know what he means because of what is coming. And in Luke, interestingly, the sign of Jonah in the sense that Jonah was a sign for those of Nineveh. So the Son of Man is talking to you and preaching conversion, even as Jonah did to those of Nineveh. You will only get the sign of one among you who preaches.
Mm-hmm. I would say that the explanation for the difference in the three accounts, or the difference in Mark's account, I guess, would be that there was no sign in the way that they were meaning. No sign like that. Mm-hmm. Really, the sign of Jonah is more like a prophecy than a sign. It wasn't a wonder.
Yes.
But it would mean something later on to the sincere souls who were mindful of him saying that. Just like later on, many things that Jesus said and did clicked with the apostles and other disciples, like, oh yeah, remember he said that, and this is what he meant. This is what he was talking about. Sometimes it happened quickly. Sometimes it happened, a long time later. Like on the Mount of Transfiguration, when he was talking about John and Elijah, they realized he's talking about John. But on other occasions, it took a long time for the meaning to come along. But the reason he says no sign, specifically in the way that they were demanding, but the sign that he would give would be a sign that would actually be done sometime later, obviously in his resurrection, death and resurrection. So, good observation though, because I sort of forgot to point out that the others were different. Wayne, did you have something?
No, that's fine.
Okay. So, here was Jesus' reaction. We took a glance at this Wednesday night as I got ahead of myself. But they came to him arguing, demanding a sign to test him. And Jesus sighs deeply in his spirit. Why do you think he sighed deeply in his spirit? What does that even mean? To sigh deeply in your spirit. Usually we sigh deeply with our mouths or with our whole facial expression along with our mouths or nose. That's what a sigh is. But what does it mean to sigh in your spirit?
I think on this occasion it was because he knew how hard their hearts were, and no matter what he did or what he said, their minds were not going to be changed. Mm-hmm. And it broke his heart.
Yeah, I think that's probably what it was. Broken heart because of their hard heart. And it's like still, not that he was overly surprised, but the fact that they were still doing this. And every time another thing like this came up, it would just be amplified more and more. The longer time goes on and the more he's doing, the more he's teaching, the more time they've had to process and maybe come along, come around. Now every time an obstacle like this comes along, it's like another boulder on his shoulders that he just, it's exhausting that this is still happening. And it's upsetting, it's disappointing. You ever been disappointed in somebody before?
Yes.
Oh, Katana says yes, okay.
That's like when you talk to people
over and over and over and over and explain what the Bible says and what it means and why it means that and blah, blah, blah. And they hear it, but they don't do anything about it. They
Yeah.
just leave it at that.
And then another day goes by, and another day goes by, and still no sign of change, no sign of action. I wonder if Jesus sighs deeply in his spirit ever because of things that he sees us do or not do.
Yeah,
Probably.
every day.
He probably never gets to stop. It's just one big long sigh in his spirit, maybe, because of how many times we might do that. Something that would bring about that reaction. But it's just an interesting statement, like I pointed out Wednesday night. He sighed deeply in his spirit. Because we can imagine him doing that a lot throughout his ministry, but we're not told about it often. So that was his reaction. But like we said, his actual response was, I'm not going along with this. Sign of Jonah is all that you'll give. That's not the first time he's done that either and said that. So he gets back in the boat, they leave, and he looks to his disciples. I'll just read verses 14 through 21. It says, "Now they had forgotten to bring bread." This is from Mark 8. "And they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, 'Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod.'" Again, a little bit different in the others. "And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, 'Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?' They said to him, 12. "And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" Okay, so we can't help but notice a little bit of a connection between the way he responded to their sudden talking about having no bread, which we'll explain in just a second, with what we might think or imagine that Jesus was thinking about the Pharisees right before. Do you not yet understand? I mean, this would have been a very appropriate response to them. Do you not yet understand? Are your hearts hardened? You don't get it? You're still doing this? You still don't understand? Another ironic thing is that he had already pointed out with the parables about how I speak to the multitudes in parables so that they won't understand, pretty much, to paraphrase, that having eyes they may not see, having ears they may not hear. But then he said, "Blessed are your eyes because they see, and blessed are your ears because they hear." And now he's questioning that, or more provoking them to question it themselves. Having eyes, do you not see? That's exactly what he said about the other people before. But now it's like they aren't that far ahead of them. Are your hearts hardened? And we already read where he was grieved in his heart because, or rather that they didn't understand because their hearts were hardened, the people that were failing to understand, the apostles even. So now he's bringing this up to them. But he says, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And the Sadducees are thrown in there as well. Herod, Sadducees, Pharisees, all the same principle, that is. Not the same people, but the same principle, same idea. But that's all he said. And here they are. They don't get it. They don't know what he's talking about. They get in the boat and he says, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod and the leaven of the Sadducees. Mark explains to us beforehand that they only have one loaf left. That's just sort of a little setting the scene. Then they started talking about the fact they didn't have any bread, that they only had the one loaf, because they thought Jesus was telling taking note of the fact that they were about to be out of bread, and then that means they're going to have to go and get some bread. And they thought he was making a reference to where they're going to get that bread. See, this is the way their minds were thinking. The physical, I guess, sort of law-related, even though it wasn't, strictly speaking, law Moses related. It was more of the rabbinical teachings and the elders, the oral traditions of passed down. But their minds were stuck in that. And Jesus, we could almost insert again, verse 12. Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit because, the same kind of thing going on. But he tries to teach them with these rhetorical questions. And some of the rhetorical questions apparently weren't rhetorical because they actually gave an answer. But he's trying to get them to think. And guess what? It seems that it worked. Because, to look at Matthew's account, in Matthew 16, after he asked him about the 7 loaves, for the 4,000, how many baskets you gathered? The question's worded a little bit differently. But in verse 11, Matthew 16, he says, how is it that you fail to understand that I didn't speak about bread? I'm not talking about bread. Now, what did he say again? He said, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and Herod. They heard leaven, they thought bread. He says, how do you not understand that I'm not talking about bread? Nobody's talking about bread. That statement apparently made it, now they got it. He's not talking about physical bread. He's talking about teaching. The teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Beware the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. He repeated it in Matthew's account. He repeats that statement. I'm not talking about bread. Now let me say it again. Beware the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And then they realize, he means they're teaching. Yeah, Ty?
I think that's probably me personally, think that this goes perfectly with he sighed in his heart or his soul, because the teachings of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, he knew that they had such an influence over people that if they were denying the truth, then they would deny the truth to others, and that's what he was there to do, was to save people. So
yeah, absolutely. The truth is what can make people free. And if somebody's heart is hardened to the point that they will not accept and receive the truth, then what hope do they have? None. So it's a big deal. Understanding is very important, and reception of the truth. So, and Jesus knew that, and that's why he was so patient. And by the way, all of these things that we could say about Jesus are the same reason we should be patient with people. And we should be diligent and try in the best way that we can, to always try to pursue the most effective possible way to reach a specific person with the truth. It could be different from person to person, but we have to be mindful and invested in that individual to see how we can most effectively present them with the truth. And knowing them is always the first, most important thing that you can. It's not always necessary, but 999,999 times out of a million, it's going to be a crucial element of it. So, they finally got what he meant. He's talking about the teachings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, isn't that interesting? Because as far as the Jews were concerned, what was it that the Pharisees and Sadducees, maybe not the Sadducees so much, but especially the Pharisees, what was it that they would have been known to teach? The law, which is pretty important to a Jew. But Jesus says, beware the teaching of the Pharisees. Not when the Pharisees teach Moses, because when the Pharisees teach Moses, that's not the teaching of the Pharisees, that's the teaching of Moses. But the Pharisees had a whole slew of other teachings that Jesus did not honor, that he did not submit to, that he did not practice. And he's been called out for it time and time again. But there were some of those things that the Pharisees would have taught that were actually disabling as far as receiving the truth. And they were proving it in their own lives. And that's why they're here again. Here they are arguing and trying to demand a sign to test him, because their teachings and beliefs, etc., is actually hindering them from coming to the truth of him. The truth that he is, really. And even the truth of the actual law that they claim to follow, for that matter. So that was a good lesson for them to learn. Very quickly, now he goes on to Bethsaida. Mark alone records this situation, this particular event, in healing a blind man. And again, Bethsaida, north side of the Sea of Galilee. A couple of interesting points here that we see. I'll just read verses 22, Mark 8, 22 through 26. It says, "And they came to Bethsaida. Some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, 'Do you see anything?' He looked up and he said, 'I see people, but they look like trees walking.'" Sounds like a nightmare to me. That's kind of scary. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. He sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." So, like I said, Mark alone records this. That's one unique point, because as we pointed out throughout this study, Mark is the fast-moving, the action movie gospel where Jesus went and did this, and immediately he did this, and this is how that went. And then he did this, and this is how that went, about a verse or two to describe that. Then he went and did this, then he went here, and then he went here. But sometimes Mark records things in more detail than Matthew or Luke, and sometimes he records things they didn't even record at all. And this is one of those occasions. So, another unique thing about it is that before healing him, Jesus took him out of the spotlight, so to speak. He took him outside the village. It's not the first time Jesus did this either. Very recently we saw an occasion where he did that. Right here in chapter 7, the end of chapter 7. Again, the one that only Mark records. They wanted him to touch him, because naturally they would associate touching with the healing, even though Jesus didn't always do it that way. And I guess arguably, more often than not, didn't do it that way. But he took him out of the village, away from the people. That's the significance of that. Away out of the village, away from the people. Why do you think he would do that? Isn't the point of a miracle, sort of the way we think of it at least, to be seen by the more people that see it, the better? Well, and by our way of thinking, maybe. But obviously that wasn't Jesus' way of thinking, because this, like we said, is not the first time. He specifically took the person away from the people before he did it.
He's been seeking solitude for months now.
Okay, yeah. Why was it? I don't want to say it's the only reason, but what was a major contributing reason why Jesus could not get any rest?
Because people were always bringing him those who needed.
Okay, why were they bringing him these people?
Because they knew what he could do.
They knew what he could do. How do they know that?
Because
People were talking, and why were they talking?
They got healed.
They got healed, and Jesus did it. And people saw it. People saw it. They went and told people about it. And that's what you and I would do too. If you saw it. And even when he told them not to tell, they went and told anyway. And then we read that intriguing remark that the more he told them not to tell, the more they went and told. What a strange way of things. So that may be a little bit of why he now, twice, two in a row here, two accounts, besides the feeding of the 4,000, two individual accounts of healing somebody. He specifically and deliberately took them away from the people to do it. And then afterwards, as we see, he told him, don't even go back to the village. Obviously, he wasn't from that village. So he said, you can go home, but don't go back to the village and and show the people that you can see, and don't go in there and say, hey, give me an eye test. Let me show you. Watch what I can do. Never been able to do this before. Now I can. Don't do it. Just no. Go. Send him to his home. Don't even go back into the village. That's probably a major reason why he did that. And we see two stages, which may be the only time anything like this ever happened. And we know, we'll go ahead and throw out there, has nothing to do with Jesus getting it wrong. He didn't do the right dosage. He didn't spit enough or whatever. There's nothing to do with he wasn't able. We can speculate as to why this happened, but bottom line is we're not told, and so may not be very fruitful to even speculate. But we know that Jesus had a reason for everything he did, and this would not be an exception. So first he spit on his eyes, then laid his hands on him, said, okay, how about now? Did I do anything? He said, well, I can see people. I see people. But they look like trees. Have you ever seen a person that looked like a tree? That wasn't in the NBA?
They've been able to see and have lost his sight, maybe from a fever or something, but
Okay.
that's how we know that it's like a tree.
Yeah. Maybe Jesus should have said that. Wait a minute. How do you know what a tree looks like? Obviously, he wasn't born blind. Or else, maybe we're taking that too literally. But I think the point is, and by the way, it probably wasn't born blind. He wasn't totally blind, or born blind is a lie. But he couldn't see distinct clarity. He could see the shapes, the figures, but he wouldn't be able to, it would be blurry. Like I can take my glasses off and I can tell that's a clock up there, and I can pretty much read the clock, but the numbers are very blurry. But if I put these on, oh, okay, makes sense. Smaller writing, no hope without my glasses on from a distance. He could see the figures, the shapes, but not clear, not good eyesight, what we would call it. You wouldn't want him behind the wheel, okay, to say the least. Wouldn't want him driving the chariot, maybe. Unless his horses could do most of it. So, then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again. And this time, his sight was restored. He saw clearly. So that's just another unique little tidbit about that particular miracle, that we rarely see Jesus perform a miracle, and then it's like this weird halfway thing, and then, so if we had more time, we might entertain some ideas about why Jesus may have done that. Again, I don't think there's any way to doubt that he did it on purpose, because the implications of the alternative are very problematic as far as Jesus' identity. But, yes?
In Nazareth, Luke says that he could not do much. He could do very little. It says could, not that he didn't
He
want
could not
to.
do. Okay.
So, and he was amazed or astounded at their lack of faith. So I don't find it automatically problematic that he does something and that all that it happens. I don't see that he would do that. Certainly in Nazareth, he didn't do that on purpose, to say, since you don't have faith, then I'm not going to do it. Because Luke otherwise wouldn't have said he could not.
Okay.
It's a beautiful verb. We might have to decide or to try to understand what it means, but it is beautiful that the scripture uses exactly that word.
Yes, it is interesting. And you know, in the English, I guess there could be a little bit of wiggle room or leeway as far as is it as strong as what we would use the English word could? Of course, you would probably know more apart from the English about that particular verb. I haven't looked into that. But if Luke is in fact suggesting that Jesus literally could not because of their unbelief and the way they reacted to him, then I guess that does open the door for the possibility that that's a similar thing that was happening here. Just not he could not, but that maybe the unbelief around affected it somehow. If in fact that is what Luke in that verb, that instance of that verb indicates. Very, very interesting, fascinating thing to even think about.
Yes, in this case, all that I would say is that we don't have to think automatically that he did it on purpose.
Okay.
I don't want to say then why, but it's not to me that the only possibility is that he purposely decided to do it.
So maybe he didn't deliberately do it, but if not, the reason why it happened is still going to have to remain a mystery overall. Yeah, fair point. In Caesarea Philippi then, near Caesarea Philippi I should say, which is right there where it says Caesarea Philippi, if you were wondering, is where the good confession is made. The reason it's called Caesarea Philippi, at least the reason we're going to call it that, is because there's a different Caesarea that's not this one, and this is that one, far or to the north of the Sea of Galilee. The other one is southwest, if I'm not mistaken, closer to the Mediterranean Sea. So, Jesus now, it seems like they finally got at least a moment of breathing room and rest, because it appears from the text that Jesus is with his disciples or the apostles more or less alone, exclusively. So he asks them. In fact, Mark specifies it was on the way to Caesarea Philippi. So they're traveling. And there may have been a crowd following them, but at least as far as this conversation goes, it was a private conversation between him and his apostles. It seems, anyway. Who do people say that I am? Who do the crowds say that I am? Everywhere Jesus went, there were crowds. And the crowds were almost always distinguished from the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees or the Herodians, or from the apostles and disciples. You have the crowds, which I think of the crowds as the normal Jews. They weren't involved in any of the divisions or the denominations of the Jews, the sects of the Jews. They were just Jews. They were the multitudes, the Jews. Who do they say that I am, he says. And that's important. In Matthew's account, he says, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And he refers to himself in that way. But in Mark and Luke, he says, the simpler version, I would say, who do people say that I am? And they answered variously, obviously. Elijah, John the Baptist, one of the prophets reincarnate, prophets of old, maybe Jeremiah or some other prophet. But then he points the question at them. He says, okay, but who do you say that I am? You know, I talked about in one of the previous lessons how Jesus sort of gave Peter an alley-oop, a nice lob pitch, a nice change-up when he knows it's going to be a change-up, so he can just knock that thing out of the park. Maybe he wasn't doing it on purpose, I don't think in this instance. But that's what it turned out to be, because Peter now speaks up and he answers. And this is one of those times when Peter, he nails it. His mouth didn't get in trouble this time. He says, and we can understand he was speaking for all of them. At least after what came out, they would have said, yeah, that's for us too. We say the same thing. He said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, in Matthew's account. The Son of the living God. Mark's just says, you are the Christ. You are the Son of the living God. Okay? That's what we call the good confession, the great confession, is that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God. Jesus is the Christ, as far as what the Jews, the Jewish Messiah, the Christ of the Old, prophesied of the Old Testament. He's the Son of the living God. And to take that a step farther, that would mean He is God. As John says in John 1, as the Hebrews writer says in Hebrews 1, as Paul says in Colossians, He is God. He's the Creator even, the creative agent in the creation of the universe. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. The people, isn't it interesting that they didn't mention that as one of the options that any of the people had been saying? We know that some of them had said, these are the Christ, like the woman in Samaria. Could this be the Christ? And so on. But he didn't say that. It was Elijah and Jeremiah or other prophets, John the Baptizer. I'm sure that's just an abbreviated version of their answer. But Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And that, Jesus says, upon this rock I will build my church. This is the first instance of Jesus using the word church or talking about the church. His church. Hasn't been brought up yet. This is Matthew 16. More than halfway through as far as the chapters are concerned. He now mentions that his intention is to build a church. And he says the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. Not the gates of hell will not prevail against it. The gates of Hades, in my opinion, is fairly a quite unfortunate mistranslation in this verse. But the Greek word is Hades, not the word for hell. But the idea is, I will build my church upon this rock. The rock, what you just said, that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God. I will build my church. That will be the foundation. I will be the foundation. And even death will not stop me. Now, they didn't get that yet. But Jesus did go to Hades, didn't he? For at least 3 days. Seems that he went for 3 days. The 3 days that his spirit was separated from his body, while his body was in that tomb, he was in Hades. As he told the thief on the cross there. But he didn't stay there, as Peter would preach later in fulfillment of David's prophecy, not leaving his soul into Hades or Sheol. But even though he would be killed, he would still build his church. And maybe we'll take some time in the next lesson to elaborate on that a little bit. Any thoughts, comments, or questions?
Seth,
Mm-hmm.
if I heard you right, you seem to have said that upon this rock, your confession, I will build my church. Did I hear you right?
Yeah.
But he says, you are rock.
Yep.
You are rock. I say to you, you told me that I am the Christ, and I say to you, you are rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. I am very sympathetic to I will build my church upon your confession, but that's not the natural way to hear this phrase. You are rock, and upon this rock, which rock? This. You are rock. You.
Okay.
I will build my church.
I understand.
I don't imply anything. I'm not loading this with anything special.
The only thing I would say with the time that we have, or that we don't have, is that the nature of the grammar and the genders of those two words are different, which according to the Greek scholars at least, which I'm not one, if the gender doesn't match, then the words cannot refer to the same thing. So
Cool.
Petros is masculine, Petra is feminine, and therefore they are not references to the same thing.
Yes, thank you.
There's more than just that, but that to me would be more or less the most objective of them.